Their leader, Jesus of Nazareth, had just been executed.
The disciples are terror-struck. They don't know what to do.
12 men in fear for their lives.
I was just looking at the group being composed. I'd say disaster area.
Yet these terrified men became the founders of a worldwide faith.
None of them ever expected it to turn out the way it did.
Modern science can now help us understand how 12 ordinary men from the backwaters of Galilee could end up as giants of history, the disciples. The disciples spread Jesus' message across the ancient world. Many of them sacrificed their lives for it. The transformation of this tiny, threatened group into a world religion is a remarkable story. But to understand it, we need to trace their journey from the very beginning. Historical breakthroughs are giving us new insights into the lives of the disciples. The picture that's emerging is vivid and surprising. One thing's clear from the outset. The disciples came to Jesus for a set of very different reasons and with very different hopes. By the time they were in their 20s, the first of those reasons may have been financial. Hefty taxes would have been a constant concern for the 4 disciples who worked as fishermen. John, brothers Peter and Andrew and James,
we know that James and John, Peter and Andrew were in a partnership from the Gospels, from Luke. So they are under a lot of pressure to catch the fish in order that they meet their obligations, both to feed the families and to pay the tax collector.
The fishermen were forced into a contract with the tax collector to hand over their catch, including fresh fish like carp and sardines, in return for inferior salted fish. It was an unfair exchange bound to breed resentment.
All of the fish have been counted from the catch, and the agents of the tax collector come and take that away to go to some of the tables of the rich people in the city. In return, the fishermen are going to receive, as a part of their contract, processed fish, probably salted fish. And the feeling that they have at that moment must be, we can't eat our own take.
This amounted to enormous financial pressure. People longed for more control over their lives. They were looking for a leader to help them fight back. Maybe they thought that leader was Jesus.
The initial followers of Jesus were attracted to something very practical that dealt with daily life, that dealt with real issues. We would misconstrue it to call it a purely religious movement.
While some of the disciples may have joined the Jesus movement to challenge taxes, it doesn't explain why all 12 joined. In particular, it doesn't explain Matthew. Before he became a disciple, Matthew was a tax collector. We know about his job from the Gospels, but they don't tell us why he was attracted to Jesus. For one thing, unlike the fishermen, Matthew lived the comfortable life of a wealthy man. James Strange is an archaeologist whose excavations of ancient villages have helped to paint a picture of life in the first century.
People who lived in any village in the Galilee, their houses from the outside would look absolutely identical. The only way you could have a luxury good would be inside the house. You might plaster a room very finely and paint it very nicely, but that's only for those inside the house. No one outside would have any idea unless they were invited in.
The inside of Matthew's house would have shown that he was far wealthier than his neighbors.
If Matthew were a low-level tax official and only had a few villages assigned to him, he would still be richer than anybody else in any of those villages.
But his wealth would have made Matthew a hated figure in his community. Every day he would have faced an uphill struggle just to get the job done. Richard Horsley is particularly interested in the economic side of life in first century Galilee. He's found that tax was paid in produce rather than money, and that the Galileans would have devised ways of limiting how much they handed over.
Over the centuries, peasants have developed clever ways of avoiding heavy taxes. Let's say this is the amount of grain that's owed to the tax collector. Peasant brings it in, puts it on the scales. The tax collector sees that it's just the right weight. But then when we look inside the basket, see what's actually in there, sure enough, it's grain, but at the bottom, sticks and stones. And by that device, the peasant was able to save some of the grain that he otherwise would have owed to the tax collector.
This daily confrontation could have been the spur for Matthew to join Jesus.
He would be really utterly alone. I mean, it would be very difficult for him to find people to have just ordinary socializing with. He'd be in a very precarious position. And I imagine, to tell you the truth, that he would probably also have to have bodyguards.
By joining Jesus, Matthew turned his back on tax collecting and was welcomed, maybe for the first time, into a community. Perhaps an even more puzzling disciple than Matthew is Judas Iscariot. Judas has a bad reputation, untrustworthy and disloyal. But ironically, he was the group's treasurer, looking after donations to the group and organizing provisions.
So here you have this band of disciples. They're living out of some kind of a common fund. And he apparently is the bursar. He handles all the accounts, keeps track of what we need. A quartermaster, if you, I think it involves some organizational ability, some trustworthiness, some leadership.
So far from being the bad boy, when Judas joined the Jesus movement, he must have been regarded as one of its most reliable members. Unfortunately, we know very little about the remaining disciples. There's Thomas and Philip, who's said to come from the same area as the fishermen. There's a Bartholomew and a Simon, known as the Zealot, probably because he was very strict about upholding Jewish religious law. But there is a controversial theory that Simon, along with Jude and another disciple called James, were actually Jesus' brothers. They may have been stepbrothers rather than blood relatives. Nevertheless, some experts believe that they were part of Jesus' family.
The brothers of Jesus that are named in the Gospels turn out to be, lo and behold, James, Simon, and Jude. I think we have to entertain at least the possibility, since Jesus, when he dies, passes on the control of his community to his own brother James.
Whatever the blood ties between Jesus and some of his disciples, it's clear that these 12 men were very different from one another. Such variety might make an interesting group, but you'd think a radical movement such as this would need like-minded recruits. Carey Cooper specializes in group psychology. We asked him to apply modern psychological principles to what we know about the disciples, to find out how hard it would be for such a group to work together and become founders of a new faith.
When I look at the disciples, I would have thought, as a psychologist, if I was just looking at the group being composed, I'd say disaster area. Coming from totally different kind of backgrounds, a tax collector, people who are revolted by the taxes, a zealot, all sorts of different characters, very different. Now, if they had a leader that could kind of resolve their differences and the potential conflicts that are going to come on board, and got them to think about what the ultimate objective is and how that objective could meet their own personal needs, then it would work.
These 12 men from such diverse backgrounds did have a strong leader in Jesus, and they had a mission. They may have been prepared to give working together a chance if it meant they would see some action against the Romans. But following Jesus was never going to be easy. There's evidence that traveling together as a group may have been a harsh enough experience in the first century to put these very different personalities to the test. Galilee is about 35 miles across. The disciples could walk it in a day or so, but the terrain can be rugged. In these places, there was little protection from the elements or from robbers.
Life on the road is quite hard, actually. There are people who regard that as their territory sometimes, and they don't like you coming through. There are wild animals you have to think about. In the ancient world, actually lions and bears were the two prime predators you had to think of.
As if life on the road wasn't dangerous enough, the Bible records that Jesus told the disciples to leave their possessions behind. Even so, there are some basics that experts believe they would have needed.
For example, in very bad weather, you really need a wool mantle like this to dress yourself in. You can wrap it tightly about yourself and sleep in it like a tent. You can also use it as a raincoat because it is impervious to water. If someone is not friendly and has not given you fire, you have to have a way to make fire. You'll need a piece of iron and a piece of flint and a scorched piece of linen so that you can nap your own fire. Otherwise, you're in a terrible position. Now, in terms of security, you might need to defend yourself from wild animals, from predators. Here is a sword. It's rather small, but you get the idea. When Jesus is arrested, two of the disciples have swords. You can put this then on a belt around your thigh underneath your clothing.
If the disciples did leave everything behind to follow Jesus, even something as fundamental as finding food could be a problem. There's a clue in the Bible as to how they fed themselves. In one story, they are said to take grain from a field. This may sound as though the disciples turned into thieves, but Jewish law made provision for the poor, including travelers.
If you have a field, because you're a landowner, and you're harvesting the field, you have to leave bits with the corner of the field untouched so that the poor can come and collect from it.
One of the most important things that you have to do in ancient Judaism is practice hospitality. And part of the reason for this is very simple. You're at the mercy of people when you're traveling. There are no hotels, there are no inns, there are no nothing. So both in Jewish law and in Jewish custom, you practice hospitality.
When they traveled, the disciples left behind more than their livelihoods. Many had other responsibilities.
Most of the disciples seem to have been married. We certainly know that Peter was married. And I think it would have been very difficult for his wife and children left behind. The disciples were the people who brought in the money. They were the ones who caught the fish or who worked on the land. And I think it would have left the families in very, very difficult circumstances.
However, we may be wrong to assume that once they left, they never returned.
We have a number of references to them going out, and it couldn't be more than a few days, and then they come back again. So I don't think we should picture it as a lot of the movies and popular books have the idea. He's always on the road, day and night, just traveling from the day he starts till the day he dies. There's lots of time in between.
The disciples and Jesus may have gone home at night.
We do have the story of Peter, who's called by Jesus. He leaves everything, and then only a few verses later, he's going to have tea with his mother-in-law. And so that gives the impression that maybe the break, at least in the early period when Jesus' ministry was located in Galilee, maybe the break wasn't quite so clear-cut as we're often led to believe.
As Jesus' ministry grew, there were occasions when the disciples had to travel well beyond Galilee. On these journeys, they really did have to rely on the hospitality of strangers. But it's a little-known fact that the disciples had something to offer in return. Something that was much sought after and rarely available.
When we dig up tombs, most people in the tombs in their 40s and 50s when they die. And the mortality rates look like they do for third world nations today, because after all, a very ordinary infection could simply kill you because they had no way to deal with that.
There was no formal health system in first-century Galilee. Villagers depended on local healers who had developed home cures that seemed to work. Jesus had a big reputation as a healer, but so too did his disciples.
If they went to a village, they seemed to have two main tasks. One was to announce the kingdom of God was upon you. The other was to heal the sick. And if they successfully healed the sick, then they could have their daily bread. They might have a place to lay their heads.
The fact that the disciples could heal should not come as a surprise. Faith healing has a long history. For centuries, it was the only healing people had.
It's not at all unusual to pray to the gods if you're a pagan, or to God if you're a Jew, for healing. That's absolutely acceptable. And people who specialize in praying to God for healing are also very well known. But delivering healing and delivering it in association with a religious movement would be perfectly understandable and acceptable.
In part, thanks to their ability to heal, Jesus and the disciples began to attract larger and larger crowds. But for all the good work the disciples did, healing could be a deeply frustrating experience. The Bible tells us that sometimes they just couldn't do it.
In the Gospel of Matthew, there's a story of a man who brings his son to Jesus, and the son is exhibiting symptoms we would call epilepsy. And he complains the disciples had failed to heal his son. Well, Jesus does heal the son. Later on, the disciples come and say, well, why couldn't we do it? What was the problem? And Jesus says, it was your lack of faith.
But the disciples' occasional inability to heal may have been symptomatic of a more fundamental problem. To have complete faith in Jesus as a leader, the disciples needed to share his vision, and for much of the time, they appeared to do so. But a closer examination of the Gospels reveals that the disciples did not always have the same outlook as their leader. Indeed, there's evidence of underlying tensions and disagreements flaring up in public. One instance is when Jesus tells his disciples to take their message to the Samaritans. Today, the word Samaritan describes a do-gooder, but to a first-century Jew, he was the enemy.
If Jesus told me we had to go through Samaria, my heart would sink. I would say, oh no, we've had hostility between us and the Samaritans for 500 years, and it doesn't look like it's going to get better.
The relationship between Jews and Samaritans was a very difficult one. It seems to have gone back to a problem over what was the proper site for the temple. The Samaritans said that the sacred site should be on their holy mountain, whereas the Jews said that the holy site should be in Jerusalem.
Samaritan villagers were not interested in what these Jewish preachers had to say, and they threw the disciples out. Instead of acting with humility, the disciples were furious. It was a flagrant breach of Jesus' teaching on loving your enemies. James and John were so angry, they wanted to send down fire on the village and obliterate it.
I think today we would see this as a kind of a racism, but it's even more than racism. If you think about what they were really saying, they were saying, let's kill these people.
Whereas Jesus says, no, that's not the way he works. He'll offer them salvation, but if they don't accept it, that's up to them. And he simply goes on to another place.
The disciples were not just at odds with Jesus. On more than one occasion, the Bible says they argue between themselves about which of them is the greatest. James and John even asked Jesus if they can have thrones next to his in the new kingdom.
I think this shows that there's a lot more competitiveness and rivalry between them than we often think. In many ways, this is only to be expected because first-century society was full of squabbles over honour and shame and status. And so in this, the disciples are really just behaving like typical first-century men.
These squabbles may have been typical, but according to psychologist Carey Cooper, they could escalate into damaging power struggles.
We have in almost all groups a James and a John. And the reason I say that is because they're a bit fiery, a bit revolutionary, but I think that they actually kind of want a leadership role. I think they're people who one has to manage quite carefully, otherwise their innate needs for leadership or to be in a position of influence or to be rebellious will get in the way.
The disciples managed to keep their differences in check, most of the time. But on one occasion, these divisions threatened the very survival of the movement. A woman came in and poured expensive perfume over Jesus. The disciples were not impressed.
The disciples are annoyed that this woman has wasted this oil on Jesus. They say she should have taken it away, she should have sold it and given the money to the poor. But Jesus sees things quite differently. He says she's done a beautiful thing.
As treasurer of the group, Judas seems particularly upset by this act. Every group has disagreements, but the consequences of Judas's reaction were catastrophic. The Gospels of Mark and Matthew say Judas goes to the religious authorities to talk about leading them to Jesus. But for now, the other disciples appear to know nothing of Judas's actions. They are excited because after 3 years on the road, their leader has just made a momentous decision. Jesus is about to take his disciples to Jerusalem, the power base of the authorities. At last, they thought, we are about to see some action. They were in for a shock. The disciples entered Jerusalem with Jesus on what's become known as Palm Sunday. Jesus received a rapturous welcome, but it couldn't have come at a more politically sensitive time. Jerusalem was packed with pilgrims come to celebrate the festival of Passover, remembering how Moses had led their ancestors out of captivity in Egypt. According to James Charlesworth, a biblical historian based in Jerusalem, Passover would have prompted the disciples to think about freedom and overthrowing the Romans.
It is a time of great excitement. The Jews are going to celebrate Passover. What does that mean? They are going to reenact and relive God's salvation of his people. So it's a very volatile time. It's a time when everybody is at the peak of excitement.
The highlight of the festival was a shared meal later that same week. But as they settled down to eat what has become known as the Last Supper, Jesus was unusually subdued.
Suddenly, in the midst of the meal, Jesus starts to talk about his death. He picks up the bread and says, "This is my body." He picks up the cup and says, "This is my blood." And he starts talking about doing things in remembrance of him. And I think the disciples must have wondered what on earth he was on about.
It's not clear why the disciples didn't understand what Jesus was talking about. Perhaps all along they had just been waiting for some kind of uprising. The death of their leader was not part of the plan. But what happens next seals their fate. Judas sets off a chain of events that would lead to Jesus' crucifixion. He makes his fatal deal with the authorities. He agrees to betray Jesus. In return, he gets 30 pieces of silver.
If we're right that the piece of silver in question is the Roman and Greek denarius, then he's getting about 30 days' wages in silver. And that happens to be the price in some slave markets for a slave.
Not much for someone who would come to be worshipped as the Son of God. But Judas nonetheless accepts the money. He leads the guards to where he knows the group will be. Suddenly, everything they had worked towards begins to unravel. The disciples panic and lash out.
The disciples are terror-struck. They don't know what to do. Peter's reaction is to draw his sword and to cut off the ear of the high priest's slave. And I think that's quite understandable. They really don't know what's happening. They don't know at that stage whether the arresting party are just going to arrest Jesus or whether they've come for them as well.
In fact, only Jesus is arrested. The disciples themselves scatter.
We have this single line in the Gospels, they all forsook him and fled. And I think we should see this on very human terms. It's nothing very theological or profound. They just got scared and they ran.
All the work of Jesus and the disciples undone by one man's act of treason. But some experts are not so sure that Judas was to blame. A new theory suggests that a fundamental mistake was made in translating the word betray, and that Judas did not, in fact, betray Jesus. In Greek, the word simply means to hand over. It does not have the more sinister implications of betrayal. Indeed, there's other evidence that Judas was not a traitor. Everyone, including the religious authorities, knew Jesus and where to find him.
What did he betray? Does he betray who Jesus is? Everybody knew who Jesus was. Did he betray where Jesus could be found? It makes the Gospels very clear that he goes to his customary place. So if we're not sure what he betrayed, how could he be called the betrayer?
Certainly when Judas comes with guards to arrest Jesus, his greeting is strange for a traitor. A kiss.
Does a kiss suggest betrayal? In all our ancient sources, Philo, Josephus, and the New Testament, we hear that a kiss means a greeting or a farewell. There's no such thing as a kiss of betrayal.
What's convinced some experts that Judas didn't mean to betray Jesus is his response when he hears that Jesus is to be executed. But if Judas didn't want to betray Jesus, there still must have been a reason for his deal with the authorities.
I think one thing we could suggest is that he thought this would help Jesus to have the audience with the high priest. This would help the man that could do miracles, even bring people back from the dead, to confront his enemies straight on and establish the kingdom that he so earnestly wanted to establish.
This is a controversial theory, and not everyone is convinced.
There's a certain attractiveness in that, I think, in that it makes what Judas has done more understandable. But I think that's very unlikely. All the Gospels suggest that Judas did betray Jesus for whatever reason, and we'll perhaps never know what that reason was.
Intentionally or not, the fact remains that Judas hastened the death of Jesus. If the disciples had any doubt that Jesus' arrest meant the end of the group, they must have been certain the next day. As their leader was crucified, it isn't clear where the disciples went.
They could have gone to a safe house where they had had the Last Supper. There seems to be some kind of a connection there when they rent that place or arrange for that place. But I think we have to assume that when they fled, they really fled. They wanted to stay out of danger.
The disciples were at their lowest ebb.
This is a critical stage because they've lost their leader. All groups need their leader, and particularly an inspirational leader like Jesus. Very, very critical. There is no real deputy, so that's a bit of a problem. So the group is likely to split up or have enormous difficulties.
With their leader dead, the disciples were left utterly depressed and broken. And yet we know that these forlorn individuals founded what went on to become a major world faith. Clearly something happened to change their fate. Within days of Jesus' execution, there were stories of him rising from the dead. Maybe this was what kept the disciples going.
All the disciples are together again in the upper room. They've got the doors firmly shut because they're worried about the Jewish authorities. And suddenly, Jesus appears in the room and says, "Peace be with you." This, I think, is a significant moment in the gospel story. I think the thing that really differentiates the Jesus movement from similar messianic movements in the first century is they're full of the conviction that their Messiah has survived death. And so this is a symbolic, empowering moment.
This belief that Jesus was still alive was one thing, but if the movement was to continue, they had to convince others that Jesus had risen from the dead, and that wasn't going to be easy. For this reason, many think another event was crucial for the survival of the movement. It's become known as Pentecost, and it took place several weeks after Jesus appeared to the disciples. Since that appearance, they had been spending their time together in prayer.
And something very strange happens to them. They feel this mighty wind rushing through the building. They see the Holy Spirit like little flames of fire resting above each other's heads. And somehow they feel empowered to go out and preach to people. And the amazing thing is that everybody seems to be able to understand their preaching in whatever language they natively speak.
It's this religious event that psychologist Carey Cooper believes transforms the group.
Pentecost, in my view, is the critical event for the group. And the reason it is because they don't have a leader, and the shared experience brings them together. It motivates them. It encourages to go out and preach and to convert people and to share their common experiences. It's a kind of surrogate leadership role.
Before Pentecost, the odds of the disciples founding a new faith were slim. Their different backgrounds, their infighting, and above all, the loss of their leader. It was a remarkable transformation. On the surface, it seemed to be simply a psychological shift, but there may be more to it than that. There is now neurological evidence that religious experience causes a real and quantifiable change in the brain.
When we look at the disciples, we can ask the question as to whether or not that transformative spiritual moment actually affected a change in the brain that changed who they were, how they felt, how they thought about everything in their lives, and that was what changed the direction of what they did.
Certainly after this experience, the disciples were no longer just members of the Jesus movement. They were leaders of a new faith.
It's when they cease being disciples, meaning students, and start being apostles and messengers on their own. And that was the key event for the distinction between the periods.
The disciples must have undergone an incredible personal journey. At the beginning, they were just ordinary, humble fishermen, but by the end of the story, they become leaders of what eventually becomes a world religion.
The disciples don't fit the conventional image of holy men. They were rough and flawed, capable of jealousy, bitterness, selfishness, even violence.
The New Testament makes it very clear these are men of flesh and blood. These are really human people with human wishes. And I find it much more fascinating to realize that they're very much like you and me.